Thanks everybody for joining our meeting, our Sheffield Green Party members meeting. The first part is our guest speaker, Bob, and I'll be handing you over to him very soon. But just remember at the end, the last half hour is the Sheffield Green Party AGM, and I would really like members to stay behind and attend that AGM. So thank you. Right, over to you, Bob.
Thanks, Stuart. So hello, everyone. I'm Bob Berzins. I'll be speaking for about 25 or 30 minutes, looking at the Pennine Uplands, Peak District in particular, and focusing on the areas where grouse shooting takes place. The first part of the talk will be about the environment. The second part will be about wildlife, and there will be some distressing images. My interest in all this, the specific interest in this area, started around 2006 when RSPB produced a report called Peak Malpractice, and that highlighted some of the in and around grouse shooting areas. Around the same time, a little bit later, Moors for the Future started talking about the damage to our moorlands and what was needed to repair that. So Sheffield surrounded by hills, and very soon we get out onto this very familiar scene, like at Burbage here, Heather Moorlands. So three sort of environmental areas of concern that I'm going to look at. First of all, biodiversity and carbon storage and flood management. So familiar scene to all of us. People love walking over these kind of areas, but in terms of biodiversity, it's quite poor because we've got lots of heather and nothing else. And it's not very good for carbon storage either, because the heather plants dry out the peat soil underneath, that oxidizes, and we get CO2 released. So improving biodiversity, well, trees will naturally regenerate in these moorland situations. What we see here is a tree that's been chopped down by a gamekeeper. That's because a lot of these moorlands above Sheffield are grouse shooting areas. Grouse eat heather, and gamekeepers like to see lots of heather and not much else. Why are the moorlands important? Well, what we have here is a cross section, and we can see there's a very deep blanket of peat, about 2 meters deep, lying on millstone grit bedrock. Peat is almost pure carbon, so in the Peak District we have a carbon store of millions and millions of tons. So it's really important that that stays in the ground. Now, if the moorlands are managed poorly, then we will be losing that carbon. And we can see a sign of that. If you take a look at the stream, it's very brown, and the peat here is being lost. So what does good look like? Well, something much more varied. This is a scene from the autumn. So we still have some heather there. The pink stuff is called cotton grass. It's a good indicator of a nice wet bog habitat. And underneath our feet, we'll see lots of this stuff. This is sphagnum moss. Very important because new peat is formed in quite specific anaerobic conditions underneath sphagnum. So generally, our moors need to be much more diverse in the vegetation and lots of sphagnum. So about 15 years ago, many of the higher parts of our moorlands in the Peak District look like this. So the summits of Kinderscout, Bleaklow and Black Hill. Most obvious thing here is very much a lack of vegetation. This photo was taken in the summer, so you can see the peat has cracked as it's dried out. And again, I'll be saying this plenty of times, as the peat dries, it oxidizes, CO2 is released, plus every time it rains, this peat will be washed away into the streams. So something really needs to be done, and the solution was a multi-million-pound moorland regeneration project covering all sorts of different areas, involving some very heavy machinery up on the moors. And the purpose of these diggers was to block up all the small water courses there, reduce the flow of water off the moors, so there's good flood management benefits as well, and generally make the moors more biodiverse and wetter. So we can see a sign of that here. Here's a nice peat dam. A pool has formed behind that. And sphagnum will naturally grow there, or it may have been planted there as well. So I mentioned that many of these areas are used for grouse shooting. This is a male red grouse. So the normal density for red grouse is 3 or 4 birds per square kilometre. But up here on these moors, what moorland managers, the grouse moor managers aim for is something like 300 or 400 birds per square kilometre. So over 100 times the natural density. The type of grouse shooting is called driven grouse shooting. So the shooters stand in one of these shooting butts, and about a mile away, a line of beaters walks across the moor, making a lot of noise, driving the grouse towards the guns. It's a very successful day's shooting if a lot of birds are killed, and if that's the case, people are prepared to pay an awful lot of money for a day's shooting, something like £5,000 each. So the question then really is, how did they manage to get such high densities of grouse on these moors? And the answer really is manipulation and engineering of the environment, essentially to make moors which are naturally very wet, to make them much drier and more suitable for heather growth. So here we have a long straight drainage channel. Lots of heather around there. You can see the heather on the right hand side has been burnt. This is a scene just outside the urban areas of Sheffield, showing what a burn looks like. So burning takes place to get rid of the higher, the more mature heather plants. So there's lots of young plants there, which are the main diet for grouse. Now you may have seen an announcement from the government last week saying that moorland burning was going to stop. Very much in keeping with the talk tonight, that's a partial ban on burning, and there's lots of loopholes. You can also see from this picture that this fire is taking place on the moorland fringe. So that partial ban will not affect this. The fires here will still continue. The moorland fringe is a very important area for natural flood management to protect Sheffield from flooding. How's the burning done? Well, it usually involves quite a lot of petrol, and sometimes somebody with a leaf blower like this to flare up the bits of heather that are smouldering. This is the aftermath of one of these burns, particularly fierce burn. So if we go back to those 3 areas of concern, biodiversity, well, the reason for doing this burning really is to get lots of heather to grow back here and nothing much else. In terms of carbon loss, the fire itself obviously emits a lot of carbon, but getting that monoculture of heather plus the drying out effect of the fire itself means that the peat soils tend to be very dry. They oxidize and emit lots of CO2. In terms of flood prevention, natural flood management, we can see don't need any scientific papers to tell us that water will pour off slopes like this, and it takes a variable amount of time for the vegetation to regrow, but something like at least 3 years. Not every creature can get out the way of these fires, so that's a toad that was killed in a fire. This is an adder that was killed. The photos was taken by one of the friends up on the North York moors. I couldn't have taken that photograph in the Peak District because adders are locally extinct on the grouse shooting moors, and we only see them in one small area near Ola Bar where no shooting takes place. So the alternatives then to that burning, this rather scruffy looking picture is a patch of heather that's been mown. So a vehicle will tow a heavy duty mower, and that will not only cut the heather but also mash it up. And we can see straight away here that the moss layer underneath the heather is left intact, so that's got to be better. But if this is just left alone, then we will get lots more heather growing back here. So other interventions are needed, such as planting sphagnum and other moorland plants, moorland grasses up here. The big alternative, which nobody's really had the opportunity to try yet in the Peak District, is some form of rewilding. and that's very much a hands-off management approach. Some interventions would be needed, but really it has to be the solution. A couple of pictures now about disease. So one particular disease that was very devastating to grouse populations is called strongylosis. This is due to a parasitic worm. The solution was to put these trays of medicated grit out across the moorland. So with that diet of heather, grouse will naturally take grit to help digest the heather. This grit has been coated in a waxy substance plus a drug called flubendazole, which is licensed for use in humans. It's a worming agent. The difference up on these moors is that there's no regulation, no effective regulation, and no oversight. So we really don't know how much of this drug flubendazole is getting into the water courses and getting into our water supplies. Yorkshire Water do not test for flubendazole. You'll notice all the grouse droppings in the tray as well. So this helps spread another disease called cryptosporidium, and that's something that's found commonly on battery farms. So our moors really do resemble outdoor battery farms. Disease of heather this time. So the rusty coloured heather there has been killed off by a bug called heather beetle. This does particularly well in hot, dry summers. So if we have those more biodiverse and wet moorlands, basically heather beetle will not have chance to take hold like this, and it won't spread. But this must be a tremendous worry for grouse moor managers with their acres and acres of heather and nothing else. And you would think it would be a wake-up call to them. So how do the gamekeepers do all this intensive management? Usually just a couple of gamekeepers on a very large estate. Well, they spend all the time driving around in vehicles. This is a quad bike. They also use 6-wheel all-terrain vehicles, and these can go pretty much anywhere, including through very wet areas of sphagnum moss. So we pay millions of pounds to get this sphagnum moss to grow on our moors, and then it's treated like this. And when those vehicles drive repeatedly over an area, then the surface vegetation is lost. So once again, familiar mantra now, the bare areas of peat there, they dry out, the peat oxidizes, CO2 is emitted. And also every time it rains, that peat is washed down into our water courses. So this is our water supply. Most of the water, almost all the water in this area comes from moorland sources. It's tremendously difficult to remove that peat from the water. It's called a dissolved organic compound. Requires a lot of chemicals and a lot of filtering. It's expensive, and we pay for that in our water bills. So there's a lot of public subsidies for these grouse shooting areas. One of the reasons for that is they have the highest conservation level. This is the Environmental Stewardship Agreement for the Duke of Rutland's land at Moscar. Put easily, yeah, it's freely available on government websites, this information about how much is paid, so that's good. You'll see it's a 10-year agreement, total cost £2 million, so the landowner here receives around £200,000 a year. The scheme started in 2012, so we were in the midst of austerity there, cuts to all public services, but these landowners continue to receive these very large sums without any cuts. And back to our red grouse. So that's the first part of the talk on the environment. We'll now look onto the wildlife side of things. So what happens to the wildlife on these areas? Well, it's the same sort of thing. It's manipulated and engineered. Basic rationale is anything which may harm a grouse is killed. So there's well publicized raptor persecution. Killing birds of prey is always completely illegal. I'm going to focus on some of the other regular ways of killing wildlife here. So we see lots of dead things. This is known as a stink pit. It's a pile of dead animals that have been killed. So we've got foxes, crows, magpies, a jay somewhere in that lot. If you're wondering where all this stuff goes on, this photograph was taken about 200 meters from Dennis Knoll Car Park underneath Stanage Edge, an area that sees tens of thousands of visitors every year. So 200 meters from that popular car park, we see this if we go off the beaten path. And same sort of thing here, a bin full of dead crows. I'll take you through the three main types of trap that are used, skip some of the detail. So this is a snare, it's a loop of wire, one end is attached to a metal stake driven into the ground. This is the typical kind of setup where snares are used. So an animal such as a fox is attracted by the stink pit, the carrion there, the smell of that. And surrounding that stink pit, very difficult to spot for us and also for animals to spot, it will be a circle of snares. This is a badger that's been snared. The snare's caught round its neck. We should never see this because badgers are protected. It's illegal to intentionally snare a badger, but gamekeepers say, well, it was my intention to snare a fox, and no one is ever prosecuted for this type of scene. This is a particularly disgusting example of a stink pit I found last summer. So yeah, a pile of dead animals writhing in maggots, one of the hottest days of the year, surrounded by snares, as you might expect. So I reported this to the Environment Agency and Environmental Health at the local authority. No response from either. So if I were to dump this pile of animals on the pavement or the road outside my house, I would be labelled a public nuisance and slammed with a heavy fine immediately, but it really does seem like there's a different set of rules out in the countryside. Mountain hares, so beautiful animals to see out on the moors. They're brown in summer. You can see that's one of my photographs, a bit blurry. This one is from a professional photographer, Craig Jones. They turn white in winter. So we get mountain hares in Scotland, and England has the Peak District has the only population in England. They were in the news just recently. There's somebody's doing a PhD paper on how well they are doing. As you might expect, they're also persecuted. These hares in the stink pit were surrounded by a number of stairs, so familiar sight there. And this young female hare was actually caught in a snare herself. The wire lodged around the abdomen, caused severe internal bleeding, and that's what killed this hare along with shock. So snares are supposed to be non-lethal traps, but that's not always the case. As well as that, so continuing the persecution of mountain hares, this is a beagle pack. This is an ongoing case found on the moors just above Sheffield. Natural England, which has oversight of all the conservation aspects of this land, did not give permission for this hunt pack to be up on this protected site in this conservation area. If you take they are pretty clear that any sort of deliberate breach of the regulations leads to a hefty fine. In this case, it would be £30,000, and that would be taken out of this estate's agricultural payments. But I can be very sure when this case is concluded that the estate won't be paying a single penny, and that's typical of how things work in these moorland areas. Another type of trap now, so this is to target small mammals. They would run across this log rather than swim the stream. So this is called a spring trap. When the animal stands on the plate, it's crushed by two metal bars, which are powered by springs. To be legal, it has to be covered over to form some sort of tunnel. That's what the wire mesh is there. So this is a stoat that's been killed in one of these traps. The photo was taken a couple of years ago. Now, the UK is part of an international convention on fur trapping, and that convention said these traps were inhumane for killing stoats. So eventually, after sort of 10 years of prevarication, the UK government did the absolute minimum, banned these traps for stoats, but left them legal for other animals, such as this squirrel, again in the middle of a grouse moor. So that's still legal to use these traps on a squirrel. And this poor squirrel got its paw caught in the trap and must have died in agony. So there's no action taken for something like this either. This is another horrific image, again on the moors just outside Sheffield. This very young mountain hare has got its leg caught in a illegal trap, one of these spring traps that wasn't covered over. Quite typically, I report all these things to the police, and even after a lot of effort, there was no action in this case. So what replaces those traps for catching stoats? Well, some similar kind of contraption, but much more powerful. This is a tully trap. So these are used by conservation bodies as well. So up in the Orkney Islands, RSPB are involved in a £5 million project using 20,000 of these traps to eliminate all the stoats on the Orkneys, and that's because they say that stoats are not natural, they're not native to the Orkneys, and they're harming the seabird population there. So there's a very big debate to be had about such projects, whether they are justified or not. This crow I found near Langsett. It was poisoned. Feeling a bit like a stuck record here. There was no police investigation. RSPB took charge of trying to push that through. And eventually there was a meeting with the Chief Constable about this case. And the third main type of trap then is a very commonly used trap. It's called a larsen. That's the main trap in this photograph here. So the bird on the right is called the call bird. That remains in the trap for months. And its purpose is to attract other crows, which are naturally territorial. They come and investigate and get caught in one of these other compartments. Now, if you take a look at the Animal Welfare Act 2006, you can see straight away that there's a very ready test case waiting to happen about the legality and humaneness of the use of these traps. The government doesn't look at it like that. The government's a big supporter of the use of these traps, and it even produces official guidance for how these crows should be killed, and that's by beating them to death with a lump of wood. And that must happen out of sight of the public. And that, for me, sums up the brutality and the secrecy of our countryside. So another big supporter of this type of crow trap is the National Park Authority. If you read the fine print there, you'll see that it states very clearly that a crow that's been flying freely, once it's caught in a trap, then becomes a property of the gamekeeper. So I'll just do a quick recap here of some of the way that the laws are used on these moorland grouse shooting areas. There's no effective enforcement of environmental regulations. If a badger is caught in a snare, it's impossible to prosecute anybody for that. Three main types of trap that are used. They're all open to test cases and likely will be found inhumane if sufficient evidence could be gathered. And yet, if anybody were to tamper with one of these traps, then it's a very straightforward prosecution of theft and criminal damage. You see, the reason for this support for this particular type of trap is for wading birds. So this is a golden plover. And a beautiful bird, lovely to see these out on the moors. I'm not an expert on the numbers of them, but people tell me the numbers are struggling. But really they are a smokescreen, because the grouse shooting estates never say how many red grouse they produce, they say how many waders are on their land. So what can people do if you don't like what you've seen in this presentation, you'd like to do something about it? Well, first and foremost, find out as much as you can as a follow-up from this talk tonight, and tell your friends how important it is, because it's really public opinion is the only thing that's really going to change anything in these moorland environments. Moorland Monitors is set up to encourage lawful grassroots monitoring of upland areas. People can send in information in confidence. Local communities are afraid to speak out. I can fully understand that, because just before Christmas, along with another number of other campaigners, I was targeted and subjected to a lot of vile online threats and abuse, including threats to my home and family. And if anybody is kind of new to this discussion, new to this debate, you may well be thinking, well, that's a bit of an overreaction. What was happening there? But it's really no surprise to me. Mark Avery, in his book Inglorious, which he wrote a few years ago, makes a very strong case for the driven grouse shooting industry being underpinned by criminality. And I think that's what we're seeing now coming out very obviously. So my own writing, this is my novel Snared. What led me to write it? Well, the photos give a big clue, but they don't sort of tell the whole story. I really felt I had a story in me that I wanted to really explore and put down on paper. And as well as all the incidents involving wildlife and the environment, it's very much about the people involved, their relationships, what's going on in their heads. So a novel was a good medium to explore that, and as well as that could introduce quite a lot of sort of pace and momentum in the story there. So it's a real page turner. People who read it tend to read it very quickly, and the experts who know about these things say that it's very realistic. So check it out, especially the audio book, and your contribution for that, your donation for an audio book would go 100% to a domestic abuse charity. So that's the end of the talk. Thank you. I'm happy to answer some questions.
Right. So thanks very much, Bob. You may have noticed, everybody else, that I've switched chat off, mainly because Bob did warn us that because he put his talk on Twitter, it may attract undesirables. So chat is one method that people can get in on that. But I will now release chat, and if you could put your questions to the chat. Let me just do that, by the way. So I've now enabled chat. So if you can put your questions in chat. Eamon is helping me monitor those questions. But just while you're forming your questions, can I just ask you a question, Bob? How can moorland management help prevent flooding, and very specifically, what can Sheffield Green Party do?
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. Well, very much it needs to be a collaborative project between Sheffield City Council, the Environment Agency and Natural England, and they really need to get together and start implementing some natural flood management stuff on the moorlands, the moorland fringe especially. So we're talking about increased numbers of trees, shrubs, letting trees regenerate naturally, but also planting and increasing biodiversity there. So yeah, and that's something that our councillors, our green councillors, can follow up with Sheffield City Council to see where we are with that and really push it. Sheffield will flood again, and it will cost tens of millions of pounds to repair that flood damage. So this is something which needs to be started immediately. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So Eamon, do you mind if I hand over to you to sort of run through the questions that are coming through on chat now? So
you can do, Stuart, if you wish to. I wasn't quite ready for that, but I'll quickly be ready. And let's go with Martin, who is asking, when will the proposed burning legislation become live?
Right, I don't know with that one. I've just read the blogs. The government announcement specifically didn't mention a date. It said it was something like a statutory instrument. So I don't know if that's been implemented already. I mean, I had reports that there was burning at Moscow and Strines today. That may have been on the areas where burning will continue, where the peat soils are slightly thinner. So it's still going on now, basically.
Okay, I'll pull a couple together here. I put one here, which is how. Sorry, let me find it. The government-funded organisations like Natural England, they're supposed to be protecting the Peak District, but they seem to be colluding with the grouse shooting lobby. And Bernard's put the Peak District Park Authority, are they toothless? And that possibly could be one of those authorities as well that you could say are colluding. So maybe you can respond on that.
Yeah, well, thanks, Eamon. I think I've got to be quite careful what I say here. I mean, colluding
Yeah, sorry.
is quite a strong word to use.
Yes.
Yeah, I can see how people would come to that conclusion. I mean, I report things on the environmental side time after time after time to Natural England, and just get sidelined really. They do have powers, but I think really they're frightened of landowners. They're frightened that of the influence that they have, probably influence within the heart of government. Um, Individual officers in Natural England, they do really care about the environment, but it seems to be more about the kind of middle and upper management tiers. We've got Tony Juniper leading Natural England now, and he used to head up Friends of the Earth. But really, in his time, nothing much has changed. So, and something really does need to change up here. So we all need to keep putting pressure on Natural England.
Okay, I'll throw a quick one. Can you get the book anywhere else other than Amazon? I know you're in a difficult position on this one, but
yeah, as an audio book, if you just check out my website, there's a domestic abuse charity, and you can get it from them. So your donation there goes straight to that charity.
I've just put the website up.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. So we've got Alison asking, would it be worthwhile lobbying the Duke of Rutland? Are there other landowners? Maybe quickly look at that one.
Yeah, there's other landowners who are, similarly wealthy. I mean, the answer to that is people have tried to lobby these landowners. Really, very much, yeah. I mean, welcome any more efforts to do that, and particularly if it becomes much more high profile. Really, I mean, it really is about everybody seeing how damaged the whole the whole environment and wildlife side of things is on these moors, and really wanting to change that and being very forthright with lobbying people and putting the views forward that things need to be done better.
Okay, thank you. We have from Ollie, thanking you for the talk. Is there a succinct list of illegal traps anywhere online, and anything that we, the public, can legally do if we find one?
Right. So yeah, there's if you take a look at the Moorland Monitor's website, if you do a search for that, you should find plenty of information on there about what's legal and what's illegal. There is an ongoing campaign at the moment to publicise how the use of snares fails to follow the code of practice. There was a debate about 5 years ago, and that was kind of sidelined, the banning of snares at that time, because all the operators were going to follow the code of practice. That's not happening. So if you do some searches on that anti-snaring campaign, I think it's called, and also follow very closely what's happening in Wales, because the Welsh MPs, the Welsh Parliament, is getting very close to banning snares there, plus what's happening in Scotland. So England will lag behind on that. But the basic message, from Moorland Monitors is, record things, don't touch anything. If you think it might be illegal, chances are it's not. Most of these traps are distasteful, but they are legal. I talked about legal challenges. That would be something that would have to be done in a court.
Okay, I've got Bernard asking a question. I think the answer to this might be no, but anyway, does Sheffield City Council fund what is going on? Maybe you can just talk about Sheffield City Council's relationship to the moors and grouse shooting and other things.
Well, I'm on the steering group for what's called the Sheffield Moors Partnership. That's part of the access and recreation work I do with the National Park. So I get to hear about the management for the Sheffield Moors. So slightly confusing name, because that's basically the publicly owned moors, which are further sort of to the south of the region, the Moorland fringe of Sheffield. So I hear lots about all the good stuff that's happening there, and they are very open to natural flood management, increasing biodiversity, doing what they can to increase wildlife, and so on. And there's no burning. There hasn't been burning on that area for donkey's years. The northern part, so Sheffield Council are involved in that as a partner. The northern moors, they're sort of privately owned. That's where the grouse shooting takes place. And as far as I can make out, it's a very hands-off relationship with them. You know, there's no. The problem is that no big government organisation, and including all the NGOs as well, nobody's standing up and saying grouse shooting is wrong. It needs to stop. I think the Green Party is one of the few organisations which has said that very clearly. Yeah. So does that answer the question?
Hopefully.
Yep.
Okay, we've got Umberto saying, I'm a little confused about the current legality of heathland burning. I've heard conflicting evidence regarding what is allowed and what is not. Do you know? Yeah,
so the latest government announcement is that, like I said, the moorland burning will stop when they enact this statutory instrument, or whatever the technical term is, and that is so the burning will stop where the peat depth meters. Okay, pretty obscure, and there also has to be certain conservation designations there, which I think all the Sheffield moors do fulfil. So they're called triple SIs, SPA, SAC. So UK and European designations there. So basically saying that these are the most precious conservation areas that we have. So in those areas, those protected areas where the peat is more than 40 centimetres deep, it will be illegal to burn. But that is only about 50% of the moors surrounding Sheffield.
Okay, thank you. I've got a comment here from Bernard. Campaign through the National Farmers Union. President seems to be more sympathetic. Okay.
Good luck with that. They're very enthusiastic about killing things in the National Farmers Union. Yeah, I mean, just look at the badger cull, really. Yeah, enough said, I think, really. I mean, yeah, but I mean, if anybody has any contacts and could make any headway there, then really, yeah, it would be very useful if we could start to see some changes in their attitudes as well.
Question from Graham. We keep hearing that the moors would still need management without the shooters. Is it true? You might want to, I mean, you pointed out the 2 million, I think, was it 2 million that was being paid for, you know, you might want to look at the alternatives and possibly what it costs. If we weren't doing it for grouse shooting.
Well, I mean, that's the 2 million or whatever over 10 years. I mean, I think it, you know, the 4 moors outside Sheffield, which are used for shooting, I think they get something like £650,000 a year in government funding. I mean, the level of that is set because these are areas of land which have the highest conservation protection that we can offer, and that money is there to preserve that land for the benefit of us all. Now, the talk tonight is very much about saying, well, hang on a minute, is that really happening? I think you can guess my view on that it's not happening. And a lot of organisations, including the government, need to be held to account. But in terms of management, if we continue to provide those levels of funding, then yeah, that does give very good opportunities for people to engage in very, you know, robust kind of rewilding schemes. I mean, rewilding very much about hands-off rather than hugely intensive management, but it does provide the funding to really look after that land. Now, the Common Agricultural Policy, with us leaving the EU, is being replaced by something called Environmental Land Management Schemes, and the government in that has set out very clearly that we we should be paying public money and receiving public goods. So public goods here in Sheffield, very much about clean water, clean air, and protecting us from the fear of flooding, but also about protecting those huge carbon stores on the moors. So in theory, the new regime will address all those problems. I try not to be cynical, but I really do think that it will be business as usual when those schemes are implemented.
Okay, I lost a bit of that in the middle. Hopefully not too many other people did, but we'll move on. Steve asks, groups like Campaign for Protection of Moorland Communities claim that they are protecting the rural economy and way of life. How do you counter this argument?
Well, I think by getting people interested in what's really happening out there. I mean, this whole idea of predator control, that's the killing of any predators that may be harmful. So we've seen a lot of that tonight. Is that something that our society finds acceptable? That level of killing, do we want to see that for whatever reason? I mean, they claim it's to increase waders numbers. You know, I think we all know it's to increase red grouse numbers. Waders are just a happy coincidence in that. You know, and we really need to stand up for ourselves. I mean, the shooting groups, this is the group that targeted me. They've got their backs against the wall at the moment because more and more people are becoming aware of what's happening. You know, we're seeing changes like the partial ban on burning. We're seeing RSPB advocating licensing for grouse shooting. We're seeing the Scottish government doing the same. So licensing will be brought in Scotland. So it's all moving in one direction. And I really do think these people are feeling extremely threatened at the moment.
Thank you. A question from John. Do we have any idea how many rural jobs, including support services, are dependent on hunting, shooting, etc.? And are there any obvious alternative occupations for people currently in those jobs and benefiting from them?
Well, it's very few. I mean, if we're talking about the Sheffield area, I would think it's probably something like 10 gamekeepers being employed on those 4 shooting moors, maybe less than that. You know, other people have done detailed studies on that. I mean, I've got a lot of knowledge, but not every fact and figure. I mean, if you're looking at that kind of thing, I mean, if we did have more wildlife, if we did have, you know, a better environment there, I mean, there are huge opportunities in tourism, you know, getting people up there in a way that, and seeing this beautiful landscape that we have in a way that doesn't damage it. Yeah, there's huge opportunities for employment there.
Bob, yeah, C4 PMC, I think they're the people who targeted you, aren't they?
Yes, that's right.
And for people who don't know, it was like an advent calendar. So if you go on their news, you'll see 24 different articles targeting 24 different people or organizations. So it's worth looking at. Justin is asking, yeah, they seem like a very secretive group. Who are they?
Well, secretive, yeah. So it was originally 4 people who founded it originally, and one of those was a Peak District gamekeeper. Won't name any names. So those names are now disappeared from their website. And yeah, it's a guess, but you know, they certainly seem to be using exactly the same language as the Countryside Alliance. So I'd imagine there is some sort of communication there going on between them if it's not exactly the same people involved. And really, you know, we are talking about people who are fabulously wealthy and have a lot of influence, especially in the heart of government.
Okay, thank you. Alistair asks, do you think that Wild Justice should challenge the legality of stink pits? Might want to explain who Wild Justice are briefly.
Right, so Wild Justice, that's 3 prominent campaigners, Chris Packham, Ruth Tingay and Mark Avery. They've set themselves up as a company, and they fund themselves through crowdfunding, and they have challenged some of the far-reaching laws that sort of affect the environment and wildlife. So, for example, you saw that bin full of dead crows that I showed you. Well, Wild Justice challenged the laws that allow unlimited killing of crows in such areas, and they made DEFRA come up with some very significant changes to that. I mean, whether we actually see a huge difference on the ground is another matter, but basically, yeah, they do some really valuable work in that. Challenging stink pits. I've asked them about that. It's all gone a bit quiet. There is, if you look at the legislation that that sort of governs our environmental waste side of things, it does seem pretty obvious that they shouldn't be allowed. I mean, they're not allowed in urban areas, very definitely. So yeah, somebody needs to clarify with that legal situation, and I would hope Wild Justice could help with some funding or some contacts with lawyers, that kind of thing.
We probably could go on for a while here, but it's probably we are due to finish around now.
Yep.
And being as it's a Green Party hosted event, this looks like the kind of question we should finish with from Alison. Given the effects of global warming and likelihood of increased flooding, we can now argue to end driven grouse shooting on the basis of addressing the climate emergency. We must plant more trees on moorland. Have you already taken this approach? I'm not sure exactly what. Just putting it all down to you, Bob, but
right.
I think you get the thrust of the question. Climate emergency and tree planting.
Well, I've tried. I've written blogs which have been read by a lot of people. Looking at this issue of natural flood management, which would include tree planting and the rest of it. And yeah, it's. I agree entirely with Alison on that one. I mean, the whole kind of thing is just an ecological disaster, really, and it needs to end.
And just possibly I'll hand back to Stuart shortly, but Alison also says introducing the golden eagle would attract far more nature tourism. Well, maybe you can just quickly explain what would happen at the moment if a golden eagle was in a grouse shooting moor. What is the likely outcome?
It would be killed. Simple as that. It's there's a huge problem with birds of prey in grouse shooting areas. I mean, again, there's a lot of misinformation from the shooters. They'll say we've got lots of merlins. They let merlins survive because they're not really a threat to grouse. Merlin is a very small bird of prey. So there is some success there. Anything larger really struggles in the Peak District.
Okay, thanks, Bob. Just before I hand back to Stuart, I've read your book. It is a page turner. It did open my eyes to what I was convinced that I was reading about what actually goes on in communities involved in grouse shooting. So it was a good vehicle, I think, to get that across. And just on behalf of everyone, thank you very much for an interesting talk and passing on your knowledge.
Thank you.
Yes, and thank you, Bob. If there's anyone who wanted to ask a question, but we ran out of time or didn't want to use chat or chat wasn't working or something like that, any questions, do send to me, Stuart Henderson. My email address is on the website, and I can forward on to Bob. So thanks very much, Bob.